G'day trendsetters, welcome to episode 8 of the Wabi podcast. Today I'd like to talk about being a student of nature. It's one of the principles of tea, in my opinion. The 6 principles I identified in the last episode being harmony, student of nature, practice realization, purity, no borders, and aesthetic. This one, student of nature, attempts to bring something very central to the way of tea as practiced and developed in Japan and flesh it out for people practicing all around the world where the human being may be central to their cosmology. But in China and Japan and Korea, the human being is decentralized from their cosmological view of the world, universe. So student of nature is a very important one for people practicing tea because the aesthetics of tea derive from nature, the natural world, not the human form. So we're going to take a look at that today, polish the floor, grab a tea, and tune in. A little catchphrase that I like to use with this principle number 2, student of nature, is the culture between you and me is rooted in the mountains and sea. The culture between you and me is rooted in the mountains and sea. And this is trying to hint at that the aesthetics of the tea ceremony are derived from the natural world rather than the human form. And of course, I hear you say in the background, isn't the human form part of nature? Well, yes, it is, but it's not the centre of nature in the cosmological view of the world from the perspective of how the way of tea developed. So the best way to meditate upon this principle and really see what it's about is to get into nature, to wrap your mind around the great mind of nature. What better way than to get out into nature? And one of the things that I like to do, at least once a month if possible, is to go for a big hike up the mountains, and in particular the massif of Sandbaum that's just over there, and go across a peak of the mountains where you're on a part of the world where on one side of you you've got the Mediterranean and the limestone rocky landscape with cacti and a bit barren and windswept. And on the other side, you've got France with the chestnut trees and the acorns and grass, and it's moist. And on the rocky faces, there's different caves, including a cave where Mary Magdalene is said to have spent time after the death of Jesus. So it's a pretty charged spot. In any case, take out their religion. The nature there is pretty raw and harsh, and it tests you. And at the start of this year, I had a particularly, I had a particularly inspiring hike. And in there, I felt that I penetrated to some of the depths of this principle. And I came up with a little statement on the way home to sort of crystallise what I felt in my experience up there in the mountains. And I'll read it to you here. Tea aesthetics find their origin in nature, not the incessant chatter of human minds. Beyond the noise of society, nature offers single-minded focus. Where does my next meal come from? Do I have enough firewood to warm me through the night? Water. Awaken the mind that dwells nowhere. It's the source of wisdom and joy derived from surviving to hear the dawn's bird call and enraptured by sunsets. Self-dependence, self-responsibility, and resilience. The cold wind carries me up the mountain to a pine whistling truth. So, a pine whistling truth, for people that practice tea, will see the reference to the wind in the pines, which is a term that we use for the hiss of the tea kettle in the chashitsu, the tea room. So when you enter a tea room, nobody will be there to greet you. It's just the artworks on display in the alcove, and roundabout in the centre of the room, or maybe tucked over in the corner if it's hot, is a kettle that's gently making that sound, the wind in the pines. And this has a kind of a magical effect on people when you're in the tea room. So you've already gone through a tea garden, nature, and purified yourself with water, your hands and mouth. And that nature is there to take away your concerns, worldly concerns that might be on your mind, and taking your consciousness, taking it away from things that are important, like life and relationships with human beings, joy, love, harmony, and leaving those concerns away just to be and experience life with a capital L, and how that flows through you and nature, and how you are a part of nature and can dissolve into this big swell of beautiful, warm being and vibrancy. And then when you enter the tea room, this lovely green cloak that you feel you've just derobed and hopped into the tea room, and you're more or less bare in a metaphorical sense, just yourself, no social concerns, no hierarchy. This wind of the pines that's coming from the kettle feels like it resonates internally within you. It like seeps into your bones and combines with the stillness that you have felt around you up until this point. You have the purification of nature outside, and then the wind of the pines inside the tea room that kind of dissolves everything into one great big sense of stillness. Even though things are moving, of course, you're hearing something, but who's hearing? If you meditate upon that, you might start to get a sense of what that stillness is that we sense by interacting at a deep level with the natural world. This wind of the pines, this natural but yet man-made sound, has an uncanny knack of allowing everybody in the tea room participating in a tea gathering to transcend their thinking mind and just to step back and rest in that mind that's supporting thinking. And this mind is something that transcends language and culture. So no matter where people have come from, if everybody at the tea gathering there is present, sitting, not talking, and just paying attention to the proceedings that unfold, i.e. the tea ceremony, with this lovely sound in the background, we all feel connected in some way at a very deep level. And this sense of oneness that we get when we're in the tea room is similar to the sense of oneness that we feel when we're at natural places of great significance, where we don't have to do necessarily as much work, i.e. the preparation of going to a tea gathering, passing through the garden, purifying oneself, etc. Just by being at places like, say, for instance, Uluru in the centre of Australia, or Mount Fuji in Japan, or Mount Sumeru. And all different cultures will have a significant mountain peak or something similar that will be considered like the axis mundi, or the place between the celestial poles. And at this axis mundi, stillness and movement are one. Movement represents time, the flow of time, and stillness represents eternity. So in the Chashitsu, with that the wind in the pines reminding us of our connection to movement and stillness, it's almost as if we're sitting on an axis mundi and time flows around us, although we feel something eternal. And this feeling is shared between guests. It's as if we're realizing the Ichigo Ichie, the one meeting for all time. Tea is geared towards focusing us on this point where time and eternity are one. And this is the heart of the beauty of the tea ceremony. So this is why I say that the aesthetics of tea are born from the natural world. These simple natural sounds that come about from boiling water, fetching water, the wind of the pines that we metaphorically associate it with, out of here erupts this sense of stillness that's in the background of our thinking every day, that supports life. And interacting with that is the source of creativity and spontaneity and love, if you want to go that far, and joy and bliss, just by tapping in to that big, massive piece of unbreakable existence that's lying at the back of everything and will continue living even when we're gone. The well-being and the peace of mind that we get from feeling this in our interactions in the tea room gives us an immeasurable source of poetic inspiration, creativity, and just pure want to get along with everybody that we're there with. So all the lovely things that I'm talking about here, and some people may have switched off already because they find that it's a load of codswallop, derive from some common assumptions in Southeast Asian cosmology that arose around the 4th century BCE. Now, in Chinese literature around this time, you see a shift from human-centric philosophy and poetry to nature-centric cosmology and poetry and literature, where human beings are but one existence among many. So there's a common phrase that you'll see in Chinese and Japanese literature, the 10,000 things, or the myriad things, myriad beings. Things and beings are more or less the same thing, existences, not non-thinking, uninspired things and things that have consciousness. Everything is chucked into the same basket, the 10,000 things, the myriad beings. And the human being sits in there somewhere, but not necessarily at the centre. And this is extremely important for a practitioner of the way of tea to realise, because rather than a human-centric vision of the world, we're coming into the tea room with the humility that we are not central to the grand scheme of things. And this break with anthropocentrism, or human-centric focus, brought in a shift from values like being righteous and propriety, etiquette, to things like sustaining life and reducing desires and increasing spontaneity, which is derived from tapping in to that great stillness of the natural world. And in the assumptions of this cosmology are 3 points. 1, the diverse things of the world ultimately trace back to a single source, that great stillness I was talking about, the mind of no mind that sits behind our thinking minds. The generation of things happens spontaneously without design or purpose. So if we think about the great orchestrator, a God, planning everything and everything's going according to God's plan, this is not necessarily so in this cosmology. The way that things erupt in the world and come forth is spontaneous, and there's not necessarily any design or purpose behind the way things happen. And 3, the ultimate is immanent in the world and can be accessed in some way. So of course, where point 2 might diverge from, say, Christian values, this third point is something where everybody can find harmony, I think, where God is immanent in the world, or for this cosmology that I'm talking about now, the ultimate, or that inexpressible nothingness, is immanent in the world, and we can bring it forth in some way through our creative activity, i.e. making tea. And by doing tea, an everyday act, we're allowing that suchness to flow forth through the tender actions and allowing us and our guests to drink from that great wellspring of life. So what do I bloody mean by nature then? If human beings are decentralised, but yet we're still part of nature, where does nature start and nature stop? Well, I actually wrote a thesis about this in university. I picked 2 artworks to write about the experience of beauty. One was a man-made work, i.e. the sculpture of Miroku Bosatsu, or Maitreya Bodhisattva, which sits in Koryuji in Kyoto. And the other one was in inverted commas, a natural work of art from nature, which was a garden, namely the Kotoin garden, that sits in one of the sub-temples at Daitokuji in Kyoto. Hosokawa Sansai and Garashia were the custodians of this garden and temple for a while. Now what I found out is that it's really bloody hard to define a so-called natural work of art where a human hand is not involved. Because of course a garden, and especially a temple garden, are maintained and guided by the hands of people. And even if you're looking at a scene of nature, say a sunset, you might hear an aeroplane going through the scene, or you might see one flying through that same scene. To escape humankind is a really hard thing to do in contemplating nature. Now this doesn't mean that pristine environments without the influence of humankind doesn't exist. For example, if you go to Kasuga Taisha in Nara in Japan, right up the back is a forest where no human being has entered for as long as anyone can remember. It's a no human forest, and people can't go in there, and the natural world is just allowed to do its thing. So these places exist, but human beings aren't able to see them. So such pristine natural places exist, but can you call them works of art? And it's actually a natural work of art where the human being is involved, allowing that life force to flow in ways guided gently by human hands, is where we can really start to engage and interact with nature and start to get a real sense, deep sense, of what this life force through nature is and how it flows and works. So I'm quite happy to call a temple garden a natural work of art. Being a student of nature is a place where the human being is decentralized from the picture. We're just one of the myriad beings with no privileged place. And nature, or being a student of nature, is tapping in to that life force that courses through us and all things and transcends ourselves. It's been there before we have come into existence and will be there after we fade away. And why this is so important for the practice of tea is because it cultivates reverence. When you're not at the centre of things, other things are allowed to come into the picture and take on greater importance than what they would if we were in a human-centric world. A way we express this in our tea practice is a great example when you enter a tea room and you see how smooth all the wood is. Even though it's so old, it's been polished and cared for every day. There's no speck of dust anywhere to be seen, but rather these lovely shiny wooden boards and pieces of bamboo and tatami mats that are worked and cleaned and loved throughout decades and hundreds of years. And they're allowed to express their natural processes. When they get a bit old, we don't want to replace them. On the contrary, we want to see how the natural world unfolds its natural processes. So the materials used in a tea room or a tea hut will be there until it's impossible to work with them anymore and they have to be replaced. So again, the human being is integrating itself with the workings of the natural world, with entropy and transience, and really getting a deep understanding how things play out. And through that, we learn something very deep about ourselves. And also come towards some sort of calm acceptance of our own fate, and that can induce a lot of poetic inspiration. So you're not going to see a big bouquet of flowers in the tea room alcove. Rather, it will just be usually a single bloom that you might see something similar on your way to the tea gathering on the side of the road somewhere. But to just pick that and put that in the centre of the gathering is a way to express, paradoxically, the decentralisation of things. So something quite unassuming as a wildflower, taken and put centre stage in a tea gathering, expresses that notion that everything could potentially be at the centre of the universe. And the life force that shows, just that one small blossom, allows you to reflect on how powerful the life force is within yourself and all things. And therefore that generates a reverence and respect because they contain the same life force that we do. So tapping into this lovely, silent, still source from which all things come creates some interesting expressions that we use in the practice of tea. It's not just tea, this actually comes from incense practice, but to show how we transcend the notion of the thinking mind, when we appreciate incense in a tea ceremony or an incense ceremony, we say that we listen to the incense rather than smell the incense. So this suggests that taking in the fragrance is like being pervaded by a single inexpressible consciousness. And this incredible fragrance from a single piece of incense wood. It's not a mix or combination of anything, it's just a single piece of, a single tiny chip, a mosquito's foot, to use the phrase they use in the incense world. A mosquito's foot size of incense gives off this entire glorious world. It's like something's talking to you from nowhere, and it sparks in you a very deep appreciation from nature. How can this one tiny little speck of incense wood give off such a profound fragrance that seemingly takes you across time in a split second to last spring and next spring all at once? Nature becomes conscious of itself through you. There's a continuity there. So smelling and listening and watching dissolve into one immersive experience. And therefore we have things like the wind of the pines, that's of the kettle, and the fragrance of the incense that we listen to rather than smell. And when we look at the calligraphy, and often we can't read it, we just take in the ki or the chi of the characters and get in touch with that life force that somebody has evoked many hundred years before us, but is still resonating off the page. One of the big points is that nature has a depth that we can't conceptualize. That's why I'm being poetically inarticulate. Just like the sandworms in Dune, they represent something beyond human understanding, something more powerful than we can possibly comprehend as human beings. And this is why, by interacting with the Fremen on Arrakis in Dune and getting to know their ways, because they are deeply integrated with the natural world on that planet, by learning the ways, the time-honoured traditions of the Japanese tea ceremony, we can really start to get a deeper understanding of the natural world and its workings through this artistic practice. I'm reminded here of the fourth of the 10 paramitas, or the 10 perfections of Mahayana Buddhism, which is virya, or shojin in Japanese. The characters used to write shojin are sho and jin. Sho is essential purity and vigour, and jin is advancement. And together they evoke the sense of single-minded focus, and that focus, that single mind, towards advancing oneself in one's particular art. And in Buddhism, of course, towards awakening oneself to the greater truths of our reality. And this shojin, people might be familiar with this in the context of Zen temple food, shojin ryori. And Zen temple food primarily made up of vegetables and things one can forage in one's mountain hermitage, while one is shojin, advancing and deepening, is a type of food that makes the best of the things one finds around oneself. It's a modest approach while still trying to find the essential beauty of these ingredients, these mountain yams and berries and nuts, to bring together a nourishing meal, but without too much extravagance. Just extracting the essential flavours and beauty of these ingredients while focusing on their deeper essence. There's something about the perfection of zeal or vitality, the fourth paramita, and being a student of nature. By embracing this fourth paramita in particular, I think there's a lesson here with getting in touch and in tune with nature. Being a student of nature, there's a lot of learning to do. And for instance, in the tea world, after you receive an accolade or an award or your next qualification or something, one of the phrases a student will use often in Japanese to the Grand Master or whoever they receive the award from is "Korekara mo shoujin tashimasu." I'm going to keep on shoujin from now. I'm going to keep on striving. I'm going to keep up the zeal. I'm going to maintain the rage, as we might say more colloquially nowadays. No matter where you're from in the world, and I've done tea in Ghana, Zimbabwe, across Europe, in America, Australia, Japan, of course. When people are sitting there having tea with me, we're always able to be united by that inexplicable something. All cultures sense that there's something there beyond human understanding that lives through artistic practice. And when we sit down and share tea, this comes to the forefront. And this means that tea is like a silent language of the heart, because we can speak to each other through this language of the heart in the tea room, even though we might not share the same culture and language, by tapping in and flowing with the rhythms of the water and the fire and the wood and the tea and the fragrance and the beauty of the flower and the life force that all these things emit and project while we contemplate them there while somebody is lovingly preparing tea. We transcend cultural biases and speak to each other with deep meaning. And this develops humility within us, which is a good thing. We're not going to take hold of nature by the neck and make it do what we want it to do. We have to work with its rhythms. And if we think that we're above nature, well, like Icarus, we fly too high, burn our wings, and we get a big wake-up call when we fall back to earth. So this leads to a deep respect for our materials, caring for our tea utensils. And by working with this deep care for our tea utensils, usually crafted from natural materials, by cleaning them before and after use, we cultivate a deep listening to the natural world. And this will generate, naturally, ideas of sustainability and conservation in our practice. Every drop of water is precious. It will have a use for what we do in tea. Every speck of ash contributes to our fire, and simplifying our arrangement to just a single flower allows this notion to come forth and shine. And so by doing these things, by working our practice, by arranging flowers, by cleaning, by arranging the tea, by making the tea, by not wasting any of the tea, by guiding the way that our garden grows, by refreshing the fresh water basin for our guests to use the lovely water to purify and clean their bodies in order to come into the tea room as a group in search of stillness that is expressed through the hum of the kettle, the wind and the pines. All these little meetings and little encounters are transient and impermanent, and this cultivates an awareness and mindfulness for those same little small things in our everyday environment outside. So when we go down to the convenience store and buy a beer, we make our encounter a great one, because it might be the last encounter that we have before that person at the counter finds another job and we don't ever see them again. So by tuning ourselves to the beauty in these individual moments and these transient, fleeting encounters, we focus on the ephemeral nature of existence, appreciating each moment of beauty along the way. From the start to finish of a tea gathering is totally geared towards embracing the ephemeral beauty of nature. And in the end, we find that there's self-dependence, self-responsibility, and resilience that's left behind the string of these moments. And when we're at our hardest times, when life gets too much, and one of the experiences that comes up for me is when I was bullied at work way back when I worked in the public service in Victoria, Australia. I had a terrible experience at work for a little while where I was bullied by one of my superiors. And some people could see this happening. And another manager in the same workplace gave me some advice. He said, no matter what, when it gets too hard, you can always walk outside and take a look up at the sky. I've never forgotten that. And you have great spiritual teachers like Eckhart Tolle who echo that same wisdom. Just connect with nature. Take a walk out in nature. Or if you can't, we're in lockdown or something, look at the tree outside. Look at the sky. Look at the clouds in the sky. Feel the water flowing from the tap. There's something in these natural elements that are able to attune ourselves, our deeper selves, beyond our thinking mind, to the great stillness and oneness of life that lies behind our mental activity. And from there is where our tea should flow from. So before I crap on any longer, I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening, and rock the tea house.